Bentley here. Good evening to you. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I welcome you to our second season of the Climate of Change, our now monthly live cast exploring with thought leaders from across Canada what these wildly unprecedented times mean for addressing the climate crisis here in Alberta and how to create the impactful change we need. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Yaqsi Nakota Nations, the Métis Nations of Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. I'd also like to make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that have a stake in this land that we stand on today, and that is our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. For those of you watching tonight via Facebook Live or on the Zoomcast, please feel free to post some questions for our guests. We'll get to our guests, singular, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Should you wish me to not say your name, please type the word anonymous before your question, as this show will be shared to our social networks. Otherwise, we'll assume your consent in the use of your name in the broadcast. Tonight's guest is Seth Klein, author of A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. On a personal note, for a long time, I felt the only response equal to the challenge of the climate crisis was for the countries of the world to band together and mobilize against an unprecedented danger, exactly like we did in World War II. So I was excited to read Mr. Klein's book. What I didn't expect was that it would lay out just about every piece of what we need to do so. What I hold in my hand is a blueprint, a text that I'll be referring back to until we fix this thing. I heartily recommend all climate-conscious Canadians get their hands on a copy quickly, get reading, and let's get this done. Seth Klein, welcome to A Climate of Change.
Nice to be with you. Thanks for the ringing. I feel like I should just leave now with that endorsement and leave well enough alone.
Then we don't have a show. So it's an interesting read, and you know, you express there that you have a background as a pacifist, and that you yourself, you know, had to struggle with you know, the war framing of this. And I can tell you that I confront that in with the Calgary Climate Hub. You know, there's most of us are passionately anti-war. So talk to me a little bit about, you know, how you came around to that.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, a lot of us wrestle with this frame, including me, and it's something I speak to in the preface of the book. There is no irony in me writing a war story. I cut my political teeth, as it were, as a kid in the peace and disarmament movement in the 80s. In fact, that's what first brought me to your province, was doing that work. And I am the child of Vietnam War resistors. That's how I happen to be Canadian. My parents moved to Montreal when they were pregnant with me, and yet, as you say, I have ended up structuring this whole book around lessons from the Second World War. I should say, just out of interest, I didn't start off that way. The original book outline was different. And my original intent was to write a book that would try to tackle what do we do about this harrowing gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. And I was starting from the premise that what we have been doing is simply not working. If you look at Canada's greenhouse gas emissions for the last 20 years, all we've managed to do is flatline them. We have not bent the curve. I was always going to have a chapter on lessons from the Second World War because I had long been intrigued by the example of how quickly we retooled the economy in the war as a model for rapid decarbonization. But the more I delved into that story, the more I started to see more and more parallels across a whole bunch of areas, not just economic, and ultimately decided to structure the whole book around lessons from World War II. And I think in the end, it works perfectly because it provides all of us with this reminder, all of us who wrestle with this question, you know, can we actually do what we need to do in time? The answer is, yeah, we can, because we've done it.
Yeah. You know, the message that I like there is you're coming at it from a position of hope. And, you know, what I was, while I was reading this, I was thinking, you know, like, it's actually, think about how incredible it is that to be in a war where you don't have to go across the planet to go and kill people you've never met. We actually get to stay here and build great infrastructure and improve our health. And, so it's like, that's something that we should be open to.
Yeah, I mean, certainly what we're called upon to do in the face of this existential threat is not nearly as demanding as what people had to do 80 years ago. It's interesting that you say hope. I mean, what I was struggling to do in the book is to walk this fine line that I think leaders in World War II also had to walk, which is how do you, on the one hand, be forthright about the extent of the crisis and the challenge, not Pollyanna about it, and at the same time offer hope that we're up to the task. And that's what I love about the World War II story, because it straddles both.
So one of the questions that I ask of all my guests, given that we started our show during lockdown, is, teachable moments from COVID and the lockdown. And, it's for our audience who might not have read the book yet and should get it. Seth writes an epilogue because just as the book was going into production, that's when lockdown happened. And of course, you've got to comment on that. And so I could easily spend an hour just talking with you about COVID and climate and World War II. That would be a fun show. I unfortunately have too many other questions to ask you, but I guess what I would ask you is, what do you think is the prime teachable moment from COVID and the pandemic and the lockdown? And what do you think may be resonating the most?
Well, I mean, this experience that we've all just lived through, and as you say, I mean, the timing was very awkward, right? I mean, the whole presumption of the book was the whole premise was that we needed this historic reminder of how quickly we're capable of moving and changing everything. And here we all are living through that in real time. And it's a mixed affair, right? On the one hand, there's no doubt that the pandemic has pushed all other issues off the front burner. And that's frustrating because the climate mobilization was gaining a lot of momentum. Let's remember, up to the pandemic, the student strikes, the Wet'suwet'en solidarity stuff, extreme weather events. Momentum. Yeah, unprecedented. Yeah. And that was hopeful. And it was expressed in the federal election, I would say, although less so in your province. But here's what I actually think. I think in some important ways, the pandemic sets us up well for what we now need to do for climate. Cooperation across party lines and across the country is at really a generational high. Our sense of social solidarity is at a generational high. We have a newfound appreciation for the role of government and public services, a new appreciation for nature, a new renewed respect for science and scientists. These are all important ingredients. But if I were to single out a single thing, it would be what we have seen with, in particular, the level of federal spending. They're going to run a deficit this year of about $350 billion. Yeah. And in particular, tied to that, this extraordinary role by the Bank of Canada, which has been buying up $5 billion in government securities a week since the start of the pandemic. We haven't seen that since the war.
Right.
What that really lays bare is what was possible all along.
Right.
Once governments recognize emergencies for what they are. And we've got to seize on that.
Yeah. Well, so people who've watched the show are probably tired of hearing me saying it, but to me, that's always been my prime teachable moment. As a climate advocate, I've heard so many times over the year, like, oh, look, we just don't have any money for that. And that's how they do it. They talk about, oh yeah, we can't do it. I'm sorry. Well, turns out when we believe it's an emergency, the money gets found, and it gets found real fast.
It does. And that's, of course, what happened in the war.
Yeah.
So C.D. Howe, who was the most powerful minister in the Mackenzie King government, no lefty, by the way, came from the private sector. In fact, he was the architect and builder of many of the grain elevators that dotted your province before he went into government. And when he was pressed on this incredible ramp up in spending during the war, which, by the way, the COVID spending doesn't hold a candle to what they did in the Second World War.
Right.
And his response was, if we lose, nothing matters.
Yeah. Yeah, that's some critical lessons there. Okay, so as I mentioned, I really do feel the book is a blueprint. I've never seen the economics of how this would get paid for laid out like that. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is a text now that's marked up and is going to be continue to be marked up. The one thing that I'm trying to seek out is, what in World War II, Hitler invades France. Everybody that's not an Axis power gets serious at that moment. That's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've been wondering, and I've been asking during this COVID time, is it possible that COVID becomes the Hitler invades France moment? Given that we were all in lockdown for a little while, we did start to appreciate nature. We did start to question the way we're doing everything.
Mm-hmm.
And of my opinion is that in the historical timeline, if you look back 500 years from now, one of the marks on from the 2010 till now would be Obama signing the Paris Agreement, Greta Thunberg, the student movement, Indigenous leadership, COVID. At least that's my hope. But do you feel like, number one, I guess, do you feel like COVID may be that Hitler invades France moment? And number two, if not, what does a Hitler invades France moment look like for climate?
Yeah. Well, I don't think that COVID is it, but I think you're asking the right question. What is the fall of France moment?
Yeah.
This is the big question. What is, in any emergency, whether it's climate or COVID or the war, what is that combination of events and leadership that fundamentally shifts the zeitgeist and people get it and are ready to rally and mobilize? Right. So in the war example, it's interesting that you jump right to the fall of France, because that's not, of course, how the war starts. The war started with the invasion of Poland, and Canada declares war in September of 1939. And interestingly, we assume in the rearview mirror that everyone was ready to rally at that point and everyone was on board, and that's not true. The public was not all on board. They did not welcome this. We entered in a state of half-hearted unity and wanting to limit our involvement in many ways. And so the first 9 months of the war are called the phony war by historians, and I think we are living in our phony climate war right now. But the fall of France in June, that is when the zeitgeist shifts. But also it was about leadership, to bring the public where they needed to be. The kind of ubiquity of the message and the clarity and consistency and coherence of that message. When it comes to COVID, what was that moment? I don't know. For a lot of people, it was the cancellation of the NBA season.
Right.
And then people were like, oh my God, this is serious.
Yeah.
But it's also leadership. If we hadn't spent those early months seeing the Prime Minister every morning, giving a news conference, communicating to us in words and in action that this is an emergency, the status quo is suspended, that changes the zeitgeist, all of which stands in stark contrast to the lackadaisical approach on climate. We have never seen that kind of leadership and clarity and consistency when it comes to climate. But we have started to see the events, right? I think these extreme weather events in combination are that fall of France moment. And the polling that I did with Abacus as part of the background research for the book are really showing this shift in public perceptions over the previous 2 years, where the people's perception has moved from seeing climate as a threat somewhere else, sometime in the future, to here, to now. We're experiencing it. And in many ways, I actually think our politicians don't give the public enough credit, that the public is largely there. You see it in California, of course, where the popular opinion has surely shifted. In Australia, if they had an election in Australia this year compared to the last time, there'd be a hugely different outcome because of their extreme weather events.
Yeah, it's, here in our province, my province in Alberta, the numbers that come in will tell you that we are the least likely to believe in climate science. We are the most conservative in the country, and we are the highest number of people who would still support Trump at this late date. so there is a political element to this that
It's harder where you live, but let
it's
me
as
say
hard as
this.
it gets.
It's as hard as it gets, but when, with this national polling that I did with Abacus, I disaggregate by province. And the range of support for bold climate action and for seeing climate as an emergency and understanding these extreme weather events as climate attacks on our soil, if you will, they range from a high in Quebec to a low in Alberta. But even in Alberta, the support is remarkably high. And when I'm giving talks about the book outside Alberta, I am encouraging people not to let your premier define the political culture of your province. I think there's something much more complex in the political cultural landscape.
Mm-hmm. So getting back to the Hitler France moment, one of the things that I've received pushback for in the past from even climate scientists and climate folk is, my feeling is that the Hitler invades France moment, if it's not a popular uprising, then it's something of a global cataclysmic level event that multiple countries feel they feel that moment, like when we all feel the smoke. I'll always wonder, our last provincial election, if the wildfires were going on around that last provincial election, what would have happened in Alberta? If we had to breathe the smoke as we were going to the voting booth, would it be different? And I feel like, is that...
Well, there's also an issue here around the role of the media. So interestingly, in my polling work, when I asked the question, have you or someone close to you already started to feel the effects of the climate crisis? There too, the lowest numbers are in Alberta, even though arguably Alberta has experienced more extreme weather events than anywhere else in the country.
Yeah.
Whether it was the Beast in Fort McMurray or the Calgary floods a couple of years before that,
the smoke.
And the smoke. So my perception is that the combination of the political culture and the media almost made it foreboding to connect the dots for people.
Right.
Considered kind of insensitive to connect these experiences to climate change, and that needs to end. We need our media in particular to do proper climate emergency reporting and to engage in a level of of climate literacy education. I mean, one of the things we're up against, the public opinion stuff is very mixed, right? People get the emergency on the one hand, they want to see action, and yet only half of Canadians, not Albertans, but all Canadians, correctly identify the major source of global warming to be the burning of fossil fuels.
Right.
Now, if that's true, and it is true, that means the media and our political leaders have failed to do some basic work, and we need them to.
Yeah, absolutely. So given the shifting of what's, I see a real shift of the Overton window, if you will, in that, now countries of the world are talking building back better and green plan. Like I waited a long time to hear a politician anywhere say that fighting the climate crisis is a job winner. I've waited for years. I think Bernie Sanders was the first guy I heard express it, and now Biden says it regularly, and amen. But so coming out of COVID, we have both Biden and Trudeau, candidate Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau, I suppose I should be professional here, advocating or talking about Build Back Better and talking about green plans and green jobs as part of the stimulus. And some countries are going to do better at this than others, and some are going to really take off and accelerate. What's your feeling on, between the Biden plan and the Trudeau throne speech? Do you have a sense if that these leaders are starting to take it seriously and show the leadership they need to?
They're starting to, and the Build Back Better language is something I like. And the moment we find ourselves in, where I think this is the moment we have to seize upon, I think there's fairly broad agreement among economists that as we emerge from COVID, the economic recovery is going to have to be state-led. For the simple reason that the private sector has been too whacked. They're in no position to lead this. It's going to have to be government spending. And the only real debate becomes, what form will that government investment take? Will it be to rebuild the old or to catapult us into the new?
Right.
And we certainly are hearing both Biden and Trudeau talk about the latter, which is good. You want to hear that kind of language. But the proof is always in the pudding, as it were, or more to the point, you got to follow the money. And you got to see what kind of investment is actually behind those words. And that's where I see a stark contrast actually between Biden and Trudeau. So the Biden climate plan, just to wonk out with you on a few numbers here, if you don't mind.
Wonk away.
All right. So the Biden climate plan is $2 trillion over 4 years, which is to say $500 billion a year. And if you were to convert that into Canadian terms, like the relative size of our economy is about 1/10 the size. It's about $50 billion a year, which is about right. That's about what it should be. The Stern Commission on climate change says we should be spending 2% of GDP on battling climate. And in Canadian terms, 2% of GDP is about $50 billion. And that's what Biden is spending. But
Right.
Trudeau, at this point, is talking about $2 billion a year. So he's not a little less, he's dramatically less by a large order of magnitude. And so that's the contrast.
So that's so we certainly need to push for leadership that can.
Oh, you've frozen out on me here, afraid. I'm just going to wait and hope that come back.
Okay.
Oh, here I am.
Oh, good. Okay, there we are. Okay, fair enough. I think we got an answer to that fairly fully. So, unless there's anything else you want to add to it.
No, I think we got it.
Okay, good. So the other part, I mean, I like the whole book from cover to cover, but a part that I wanted to make sure I talked to you about is I like the idea of a climate corps for the youth, and it's another thing that I feel like I've been thinking about for a little while as well. So I keep saying the book did resonate with me, and I've had some similar thoughts. There's no way I could write a book like this. This is incredible. But you know, the Hub has a partnership with Fridays for Future Calgary, our incredible youth group here. And actually, whenever I get a chance to pitch them, I do. So I'm going to, you know, these are kids that are high school and early college and even younger than that, who are speaking truth to power and going and striking in front of City Hall. And I can tell you, in this city, they were out in -30 protesting, and so you know, if anybody has a chance to support them, do so. If you ever want to feel good about what you're doing, you
lost you again.
Oh, did you lose me? Anyway, support the Fridays for Future folks. I'm not sure whether it's you that can't hear me, or we'll see. Anyways, so Seth, do we have you back? Oh, we may have we're going to see if we can't get him back. He's on
Hello
the run
there.
here.
I'm on the
We've
run.
got some action.
I'm going to try to plug my computer into a hard line here.
Sure, I love it.
This
is some action, Seth. We don't usually have people running around like this. This is great.
So now you're going to have to contend with my 6-year-old in the background.
Oh, that's all right. Hey, we're talking about youth anyways. So.
That's right. What a segue.
So I guess I would just like to hear a little bit about, you know, talk to me about what you think might be possible for a youth climate corps, and maybe how we can help make that happen. And I'd love to see it to be something that they create amongst themselves and put it on the Prime Minister's desk and say, hey, fund it. You know?
Yeah. I mean, I think an idea like this has so much potential, and it was almost like it could have happened if the federal government hadn't made such a hash of it with the WE scandal.
Right.
And partly, you know, there's a famous essay by an American philosopher from 100 years ago that I cite in the book, William James' essay called "The Moral Equivalent of War." So
right.
He was a pacifist 100 years ago, but he recognized that war provides a kind of sense of purpose, particularly for young people. And he was on the search always for examples of things that could be positive, but offer the same sense of purpose.
Right.
And to which, my book is saying, look no further. The climate emergency is it. I think there are so many young people who want to serve and who could benefit from something like this.
I think about, could there be a climate corps where, that first and foremost is for the youth, but I think if there was something that was on offer where somebody could just take a few years off of work, do a sabbatical, and go and work on climate stuff, I think this would be an enormously popular thing. Somebody who's just like,
Absolutely.
I'm tired of doing something that doesn't matter. I produce plastic items that are going to end up in a landfill in 10 years. Like, I want to start doing something good. I think it'd be an enormously popular program.
Absolutely. And I think, what I'm proposing is that it be structured similar to the military in the sense that you provide free room and board, you provide a 2-year experience, doing meaningful work, offering a stipend, and then in exchange, covering people's post-secondary education. I mean, I think particularly now under COVID, where so many young people, who might have been ready to go to post-secondary education, who now are looking at the prospect of spending a year doing that online. It sounds miserable, and instead could be making an incredible contribution and finding a new sense of purpose.
Yeah. Yep. I think it's, I think I've always thought it's an idea that's going to come. It's just a question of how long. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. But okay, so my next question, here we are in Alberta, and we're a complex. It's a lot more complex than just having a prime minister that we do and being a primarily conservative province. But I feel like one of the things your book sort of talks about a little bit, and what I believe in my heart is that we have to be able to present something that people can get behind and support. And I often talk about an Alberta New Deal, because even green can be a bad word here. But what do you think are the opportunities for Alberta with some of our natural resources other than oil and gas? What do you think is low-hanging fruit for an Alberta New Deal in a transition phase?
Well, I like your framing of that, actually, of an Alberta New Deal. I think that's a really good idea. And I spend some time quite a bit of time talking about Alberta in the book, and trying to recognize and trying to say to the rest of the country that we need to make a serious offer to the people of Alberta.
Yeah.
That Alberta, Alberta is responsible for 38% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, far more than your share of the population.
Right.
Which means that Alberta has a lot of heavy lifting to do. And a large share of fossil fuel jobs are in Alberta, and it's completely understandable that people feel anxious there about the transition ahead of us. And so we have to make a real substantive offer on the table. So one of the ideas that I cooked up in the book and offer up is I actually think there should be a new federal transfer program. I would call it a climate emergency just transition transfer. And it would be big, something in the order of $20 to $40 billion a year. And so Alberta, because Alberta is the source of 38% of Canada's GHG emissions, Alberta would get 38% of the money. Yeah. So that'd be a lot of money. Now, I wouldn't want to give it to Jason Kenney because I'm not sure he's to be trusted on this.
I think he's proven that he cannot be.
Right. So what I'm actually proposing is that we set up just transition agencies, sort of new Crown agencies in each province, jointly governed by the feds, municipalities, the province if they ante in, Indigenous nations, put some climate experts and labor and business people on the board, and let each province decide where to invest that money in a way that makes sense for them, given their GHG profiles and given the alternative possibilities on the ground, right? Because what the best prospects are for wind and solar and geothermal, right, and where you need rapid transit and all of these things that we now need to fund. And you also, and chunks of the money could also be used for apprenticeship training and that kind of thing, to actually get the job done. But a key message in the book is this. Is it hard? Is it challenging to help people through this transition? Yes, it is. But, with all of these things, I always come back to the war. That's what I'm doing in this book.
Yeah.
In the war, so about 300,000 Canadians work in the fossil fuel industry, not just in Alberta, but across the whole country, but certainly concentrated in Alberta. In the war, Canada was a population of 11 million people. Out of that, over 1 million Canadians enlisted, and more than that were directly involved in military production. All those people had to be trained up. Then all of those people had to be reintegrated into a peacetime economy. We developed these incredibly ambitious and audacious programs under the Veterans Charter to assist that. We had income support programs, housing support programs, post-secondary and apprenticeship programs that changed the face of the post-secondary education sector in Canada for a generation and changed the lives of thousands of people. If we could do that then, surely we can do this now, because in fact, the job now is actually quite a lot smaller than it was then.
Yeah.
We can do it.
Right. Agreed. So the Calgary Climate Hub works. We have a bunch of different, we sort of have a node structure. We have different focuses, but one of our prime focuses is to try to lobby city council and we get ourselves on boards where we can and things like that. What kind of role do you think groups like the Calgary Climate Hub can play in mobilizing folks at the Calgary level to take on this World War II styled footing or frame of mind?
Well, the first thing I would say is, for too long, solutions have been cast in individual terms,
Yeah.
And the thing about a war, like the climate emergency, is that they're inherently collective enterprises, and they have to be, the solutions are going to be state driven and they're collective. And so inherently this is a political project. So that's why the student mobilizations and the Indigenous land defense actions are so important. They rightly place the focus on the need for political action. But I now think we have to refine the demands, as it were. We had this incredible mobilization a year ago, the largest single day of political protest in the history of the country, probably.
Yeah.
Demanding climate action, but we didn't have clarity about what that action looks like. So the first thing I want to do is offer up to you, what are the 4 markers of when you know that a government is serious about the emergency? And because that's clarifies what our demand should be. The first is, we've already touched on the first, spend what it takes to win. That's what C.D. Howe and Mackenzie King did. That's what we're doing on COVID. That's decidedly what we're not doing on climate.
Right.
That's number 1. Number 2, create new economic institutions to get the job done. C.D. Howe created 28 crown corporations during the war. The Trudeau government has created 2, the Canada Infrastructure Bank and the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. We need a new generation of crown corporations to expedite the transition ahead of us. A lot of those are logically would be at the provincial and municipal level or at the Indigenous nation level. Or something like the Just Transition Transfer is an example of a new institution you design to get the job done. Third, you move from voluntary to mandatory measures. So much of our provincial and federal climate plans to date are voluntary. We incentivize change, we send price signals, we give rebates. Not going to work. And it wouldn't have worked in the war. When it's an emergency, you set clear near-term dates by which certain things have to happen. So we would be saying, you won't be able to buy new fossil fuel cars as of 2025. Here's a municipal one, and this is what Vancouver is doing, by the way. No new buildings will be able to tie into natural gas for space and water heating as of next year.
Yeah.
That's a near-term mandatory measure. That's what I'm talking about. And the fourth thing you need to do is you need to talk about it like it's an emergency, like we've seen in COVID. You need to have that daily, ubiquitous, consistent clarity of message, which we have not had on climate. I do think there's other things that could be done at the local level that sort of builds towards this. I do think in Alberta, people should be pressing for the climate emergency just transition transfer. It's important to Alberta. I think, in the book, I talk about the role of the Wartime Information Board, rallying the public. We need a climate emergency information board at the federal and provincial level. We could all be demanding that our media do their job. And this is something concrete people could rally locally in front of your CBC or your newspapers to say, tell the truth. That's what the Extinction Rebellion people are doing. Connect the dots, boost the level of climate literacy. You know, the CBC can make room, all the CBC morning shows across the land give us hourly business and sports reports. Give us our morning climate emergency report. And we can be out front of those buildings demanding it. We could be saying to our federal and provincial governments, ban advertising by fossil fuel cars, right? That's a confusing message. We do that for tobacco. Let's do it for fossil fuel companies. Banning the sponsorship of CAP and its members of our major cultural and sports events, right? So these are examples of things that in different ways communicate that this is in fact an emergency.
Yep, I saw a lot of those ideas in the book, and they make a lot of sense. My final question before I go into sort of our version of a set of commercials, but one of the initiatives that the Calgary Climate Hub does is called the Community Climate Conversation, and so we bring a host of experts into a group of people from a community, and they're able to have a conversation with a solar guy or an eco-anxiety lady or I don't want to put genders on it, but you know, you have an opportunity to have those conversations and conversations with each other. And then we have what's called the activation conversation, where we meet a smaller group of them who are interested in pushing it a little, you know, actually creating an impact at the community level. And I just wanted to hit you up and see if, you know, if you have any ideas about some community impacts we could strive for. And I'd also just put it in the back of your head, if you have an idea tomorrow night, or you think of somebody that you think I should talk to, please, you know, don't run to the computer and send me an email. We want impacts. We want to pull out wins here in Calgary. We want to show some leadership. So I'm just wondering if you have any ideas about how we could help at the community level.
I feel like I've given you a taste of those. The main point in the book is that we haven't been in emergency mode. We haven't applied that emergency mindset. And now we've run out the clock. So we in each way, we need to up our level of ambition. You know, our targets at the municipal, provincial, federal level all need to be brought forward by multiple years. Our sense of how much we're ready to spend on these things needs to be dramatically increased. And COVID has shown us that we can. So, I mean, those I think any institution can have a conversation about that says, and not just government institutions. I mean, it could be a large credit union or business or industrial sector. If we say we get the science, what does climate emergency actually look like for our institution and our sector? And the answers flow naturally out of that.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. I like it. Okay. I'm going to say a word about our sponsors and such, and then we have a panelist we'll be bringing on or I guess a guest interviewer who's got a question or two for you. So on behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I'd like to take this moment to recognize the support of the Alberta Ecotrust Foundation, whose grant programs have helped bring forward so many great Alberta-specific environmental initiatives, including this broadcast. So give them a follow and check out this important organization at their website, albertaecotrust.com. All of their onboarding links will be in the chat. Be able to check that out shortly. I'd also like to take a minute to tell you about an upcoming Calgary Climate Hub initiative this Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. on Zoom, where we'll be holding a city budget information session. Just as we've mentioned a few times here tonight, and as American presidential contender Joe Biden is fond of saying, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. If you are a concerned citizen or a Calgary-based nonprofit working to protect the vulnerable or the environment, join us for a discussion of what the upcoming city budget session in November means and our opportunities to influence City Council's priorities as they tackle spending cuts this November. The RSVP link can be found in the chat, as can the Hub's website and social networking links. Reach out to us. I'll also mention we have our next climate conversation, as we've already mentioned earlier today. This will be for Mount Pleasant and Tuxedo Park. That's two communities that are coming together for this. You don't have to be from Mount Pleasant or Tuxedo Park. Anybody can join, but certainly if you are from those communities, we really want to have you on board and we really want to create impact. So come and check us out. It's Tuesday, November 24th. The link for that will be in the chat. One more thing before we get back to the show, and that is how you can get your hands on Seth Klein's important and incredible book. A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency can be ordered direct from his publisher, ECW Press, or you can buy it locally at Pages in Kensington. And it's also on his website. What's that website address for the book again?
Just sethklein.ca. You'll find it there.
Get the book or something, isn't it?
Slash the book.
Slash the book. I didn't tell you I was going to hit you up with anything.
Someone's going to put it in the chat, I think.
Yeah, it is. So, you know, I've pitched this book at you as hard as I can, and for good reason. What else can I say? It's a blueprint. I think it should be taught in schools. It has my highest recommendation, period, end of sentence. Okay, so we've reached the guest interviewer section of our show. And as Seth has a full chapter in his book dedicated to the role Indigenous leadership has played for Canada, both during World War II and the enormous leadership they're showing in the climate crisis today, it makes me very happy to be able to bring on an Indigenous leader in his own right, Mr. Masquasis Boysis of Idle No More. Masquasis, do we have you lined up here? Looks like he's coming on. I can see his name in the top box there. This is one of those moments on Zoom where we all just wait. There he is. Masquasis, Tansi. You know, basically, you've got the floor here. What questions do you have for Seth?
Just want to say hello, Seth. Just enjoying your book here. Got into it the last few days. I'm a student, so I'm kind of jammed up with my assignments, but I'm doing the best I can with what I got. So my first question, let's see. So with the transition to clean energy, I just wanted to speak about a little bit of solutions and your thoughts on them. What are your thoughts on cultural and spiritual transformation, you know, where society adopts or incorporates indigenous knowledge systems, indigenous worldviews, natural laws, all of that working together with new clean technology and Western science, you know, just as a solution to that, changing how we think, our beliefs, our values, our the way we live, you know, and even just the way we see the earth.
You know, I'd like to say I dealt with those as much as I should have in the book. The chapter on Indigenous leadership is one of my favorites. But the truth is, and some as you've seen in that chapter, some of the Indigenous thinkers who I interviewed for the book raised the same point that you're raising. And yet I'm also wrestling with how short the time is. You know, we have 10 years to dramatically lower our emissions. And I fear like the shift that you're rightly saying we need to make in terms of how we actually think about our role on the earth need to happen. And I'm worried that they can't happen in 10 years. The time is too short. But I do think we, and argue as strenuously as I can in the book, that honoring and respecting Indigenous culture and rights and title is central to winning. That some of the most inspiring examples of renewable energy projects in the country are actually happening under Indigenous leadership. And we need to be doing everything that we can to support those initiatives. And mostly the argument that I'm making in the book, can I take a step back actually and share actually one of my favorite stories from that chapter is that, you know, as I was writing the book a year ago, you know, I was hiding away on the Sunshine Coast and I was writing, and this news item comes across the radio one morning that Louis Levi Oakes had died, the last of the Mohawk code talkers. So he died in his 90s. He had been one of these Indigenous soldiers in World War II who was in the Signal Corps, because what had happened in the war with the code talkers is that the Allied codes kept getting broken by the Japanese and the Nazis. And then the Americans at a certain point discover with the Navajo that when two Indigenous soldiers are speaking, they can't be deciphered. And they end up recruiting Indigenous soldiers from 36 or so Indigenous language groups, including many from Canadian territory. And their languages ended up being referred to as the unbreakable code. They're pointed to as key to certain victories, particularly in the Pacific. Anyway, I'm listening to this on the radio, and I just had one of those moments where I just thought, isn't this incredible? Like, here are these languages that both countries have spent generations trying to expunge from the earth, beating out of children in residential schools, only to then discover that those same languages were key to certain victories in the Second World War. And when I fast forward to the present, I think, same thing again. Here we are when it comes to Indigenous rights and title, which have been systematically violated and ignored and abused for so many decades. And now, here we are again, where our mainstream politicians are dithering and dodging on what we have to do on climate. And over and over and over again, it's the assertion of Indigenous rights and title that's buying us time, that's blocking the expansion of these projects that are killing us, until such time as the rest of us get serious about what we actually have to do.
Yeah, that just points to the need to start supporting Indigenous people when they're asserting their rights, or like at Wet'suwet'en, where they're just standing in the way and saying, okay, this is not happening, we're gonna block you. So
Heroes.
That's great, and big ups to the Manuel family there doing that, Tiny House Warriors.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I'm with Idle No More. I just forgot to introduce myself. I'm Musqueam's Voices, Idle No More. We work together with Fridays for Future Extinction Rebellion here in Calgary. We like to go right in front of Trans Canada, the headquarters here, and do our thing there, protest right in front of their front door. So, second question. So, I know everybody heard of Evo Morales.
Yes.
He just got back in after being thrown out. There he was call that coup, yeah.
A coup, yeah.
Yeah, U.S. coup for their lithium, I guess. But what do you think of his him creating and giving legal rights to the earth as a solution, and even trying to do that on a bigger scale? Like, I don't think it'll happen under the conservative or liberal governments, maybe under the Green. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think I have huge admiration for what was happening in Bolivia under his leadership. And it's great to see his party back in power with huge support. And you're right, he is actually practicing the kind of thing that you were started off talking about, and has been at it for some time, with a population that is a much larger share Indigenous population than we have here in Canada. And also, what I see is that he's asserting collective ownership over these resources. Many of the same oil and gas companies that are active in your province are also active in Bolivia. And Evo Morales was a lot more effective at bargaining with them. I mean, that's why there was a coup, because he was much more insistent. Maybe he had a little more in common with Peter Lougheed than anyone else, but much more insistent in saying, the people own this resource and they're going to get a fair return. And if you aren't willing to provide it, we'll do it ourselves.
Awesome. That's a great answer. So we'll go back to
Thank you, Musquasis. While I've got you here, I'll just make an announcement. We've just inked a deal with Musquasis to have him on for our next Climate of Change episode, which will be Wednesday, December 2nd at 7:05. So come and check it out. We're going to spend the full hour together. And I'm really, really happy to have you come on the show. It's important that we all start to talk together like this. Well, okay, so that's almost it for this month's Climate of Change. We used to be a weekly broadcast, that's why I say weeks. But I would just ask Seth, is there anything that we didn't get to that you'd like to mention?
Well, I was still reflecting on your earlier question about what people can do locally, and your earlier mention of the youth stuff. And one of the other stories I write about in the book that I like to tell is, and I'm biased in this, my wife is a Vancouver city councillor, and she's the city councillor who moved the climate emergency motion here a year and a half ago, the first in English Canada. And it has resulted in a truly ambitious municipal climate emergency plan that I think is actually probably one of the most ambitious in North America. And as I was saying earlier, it sets hard, clear deadlines in a way that our provincial government and federal government have not. Now the interesting thing to note is that Vancouver has a very politically divided council. No one has a majority. It's all over the political spectrum. And yet these climate emergency motions have passed unanimously in Vancouver. Now, how did that happen? Now, beyond the fact that my wife's really good at her job. And she would say, Christine Boyle is her name, that it was the student strikers. These young people, these teenagers who skipped school, who rallied outside each time there was a vote, who spoke before council, who filled the galleries, who watched, and who watched and made it politically impossible to vote no. Right. That's why it was unanimous. So, I think that's part of the answer to your question about what's the local role. It was the combination of those, supporting those young people, engaging in political work, who have produced an extraordinarily ambitious, a true climate emergency plan. And we haven't seen a lot of those. And I guess I often like to leave people with this thought. You started off saying you liked how hopeful the book was. I actually feel like the truth is, any of us who deal with this file walk a razor's edge between hope and despair.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we do not know if we're going to do what we need to do in time. That is the ambiguous time in which we live. Yeah. And I think we need to be upfront about that. But I like to remind people, and it's one of the things from which I take solace in this Second World War story. I'm going to say something that is, to say it is to state the obvious, and yet we often forget. I said earlier, out of 11 million people, over 1 million Canadians enlisted. What they didn't know is if they would win.
Right.
We know how that story ended. They did not. And they did what they had to do regardless. And they surprised themselves along the way. And that's what we have the potential to do too.
Well, I'm going to hit you with a favorite quote of mine. I don't know if you've heard it, but since you're talking about that razor's edge, I know it very well. One of my favorite quotes is from American folk legend Joan Baez, who says that the antidote for despair is action. And I've lived it, and that's actually a decent segue for me, because I'm going to talk about the hub in a second here. But first of all, Seth, I want to thank you first of all for writing this important book. It's meaningful to me, deeply meaningful, and I want to thank you for coming on our show. I also want to thank Indigenous leader Musquasis Boyces of Idle No More. I was really glad to have him come on and have you two chat. If you like this Climate of Change episode, you can find links for the entirety of season 1 in the chat. And I'd like to again just reiterate that we're immensely grateful for the support of Alberta Ecotrust for season 2. Beyond that, I'll just say a word or two about the Calgary Climate Hub. again, Joan Baez, the antidote for despair is action. And what I can tell you is when the smoke is so thick out there and you come out in the morning and there's a bright red sky that doesn't look like it's from this planet, I know that despair. I've lived it. And what I can tell you is there's nothing like going and sitting around a boardroom table with a bunch of really smart people and working on impactful action that you can gain victories on at the municipal level. And we do it. So what I can tell you is I've lived that quote, and there's no going back for me. So if you do feel climate anxiety or despair, I mean, there's other climate organizations, and I would say get onto one of them as soon as you can. But I recommend the Calgary Climate Hub as hard as I can. And if you're outside of Calgary and you can find out if there's a local climate hub, we're scattered out across the country. And if there isn't one in your town, start one. We also have, so there's other ways you can join us. You can become a member. If you don't have a lot of time, maybe you've got some extra cash and you don't mind donating to us. There's no tougher dollar in this province than fighting climate. So think about giving us a hand. We can use it and we'll put it to good work. I think that's about all I've got to say about the hub for now. I want to thank my volunteers, Shay Rogers, my producer, Joan and Pamela, who keep me on the straight and narrow with the hub, getting these things out, and my friend Paul for helping me with sound. And finally, I just want to thank you, the viewer. Good night for now, and let's get to work. Thanks, Seth. We'll be in touch.